Chapter 17. Lies Thicken. The elegant lady at the door reminded Shaddy so strongly of Mamma Bookie that she was taken aback. It was something in the lady's assured, confident face. Her black and green gellie was also wrapped above her broad forehead in Mamma Bookie's favourite style, the corners of the headscarf perched up like the tails of two little birds. Iyawo Jenny stood beside her, smiling. Mrs. Apaya is from Ghana. She works for the Refugee Council here. She's an advisor for refugee children, and I've brought her to meet you and Femi. Thank you. Shaddy dropped her voice to a mumble. She suddenly realised that she didn't know what to call Iyawo Jenny. Yesterday the social worker had introduced herself simply as Jenny. Back at home, for children to call her by her first name would be rude. May we come in? Asked Iyawo Jenny. Shaddy pressed backwards against the door, embarrassed. Mrs. Apaya talked with the children as if she'd always known them, but simply hadn't seen them for a while. She asked about school, their teachers and friends, and their favourite games. She spoke in a way that made it almost seem like everything was normal. Like Iyawo Jenny, she began with questions that could be answered without speaking. She had a way of probing and smiling, just like Mamma Bookie too. In between her questions, she told them about her own days at school, stories about friends and rivals, fearsome teachers and getting into trouble. Slowly she coaxed Shaddy into single words, then into short sentences. Even Femi was drawn into listening, and finally into whispering the number of goals he'd scored for his school football team last term. Iyawo Jenny slipped away, leaving the three of them alone on the sofa. Tell me now, how are things there at home? Mrs. Apaya asked gently. Shaddy winced and shut her eyes. It was as if another blanket had been thrown over her, smothering her voice and everything else. She felt Mrs. Apaya taking her hand. Shaddy wanted to pull it back, but the strong, warm grip held it firmly, yet without squeezing. I can tell that something terrible has happened. It's hard for you to speak about it, but it's very important, so we can help you. And call me Auntie or Mama, like children back there, at your home. Softly and surely the words threaded through Shaddy's darkness. An arm enclosed her. She silently wrapped in Mamma Bookie's arms. Mamma Bookie is reaching out to pull Femi in. Shaddy feels him soften as her aunt presses them close. They're enclosed in the heat of the day and the warmth of Mamma Bookie's body. But the sound of weeping winds its way through the house, seeking her out, seeping into her. Great sobs stirred inside Shaddy, like gusts of wind whipping up palm leaves before a storm. We all need to cry sometimes, Mamma Apaya consoled quietly. Cry and let it out. Shaddy gave up trying to hold back her tears. She wasn't sure for how long she cried, but slowly, as her crying began to subside, she became aware of how comforting Mamma Apaya's arm felt. She glanced at Femi. He was silent and dry-eyed, with a look of such sadness that Shaddy's tears threatened to swell up again. When you're ready, I want you both to help me understand your story, said Mamma Apaya. The bird's tail swooped gently with her gellie as she turned to each of them. Take all the time you need. For a while, Shaddy sat tongue-tied. Conflicting thoughts raced through her brain. Part of her wanted to tell Mamma Apaya the whole truth, including that she'd given Iyawo Jenny a false surname, but fear stopped her. When Papa was safely in England, then it would be different. They wouldn't need to worry any more about police and soldiers at home, because Papa would be with them. Until then, it was better that there were Shaddy and Femi at Adewale. Was it safe, at least, to tell Mamma Apaya about Uncle Deli? If they didn't find him, how would Papa ever know where to look for them when he got to London? Perhaps Mamma Apaya could help them. It was a risk they would have to take. Our uncle, he's in London, Shaddy began, but we don't know where he is. Stumbling a little at first, she told how they'd gone to the College of Art, only to find that Uncle Deli was missing. She gave his name, Dr. Solya, but let Mamma Apaya think that he was Mamma's brother. When Mamma Apaya asked how they'd entered the country, Shaddy simply replied that they'd come with a lady. Mamma Apaya didn't press any further. 3 days later, Mamma Apaya escorted the children by bus from Mrs. Graham's flat to the office of Mr. Nathan, a refugee lawyer. Shaddy flicked over the pages of a magazine in the small waiting room, trying to hide her nervousness. If this Mr. Nathan was anything like Uncle Tunde, they could be in trouble. Papa used to joke that Uncle Tunde should have been a detective rather than a lawyer, because he was so good at getting to the truth. Of course lawyers have to be good detectives, and if they're anything like your Uncle Tunde, they're also brain surgeons, looking inside their clients' heads. Did that mean this Mr. Nathan would know they weren't telling the truth? Shaddy had tried to talk with Femi about what they should say, but he refused to show any interest. All he seemed to do was watch television and play on his own with the twins as Lego. For the last few days he'd hardly even spoken to her. The man who came out to shake hands with Mama Apaya limped across the room, one foot sweeping the carpet. He was short, with a small, wind-beaten face that made Shadi think of an old sailor rather than a lawyer. A tuft of greying hair hung over his forehead, down to his spectacles like a clutch of dry grass. He greeted Mama Apaya like an old friend, before turning to the children and inviting them to follow him to the office. When he smiled, his grey-green eyes seemed to ripple and light up his face. Leaning across a wooden desk that looked even more worn than himself, Mr. Nathan began by explaining what they would have to do to get permission to stay in England. Shadi soon lost track. Asylum, immigration officers, forms, questionnaires, interviews. It all sounded strange and difficult. The desk was as untidy as Papa's, scattered with papers. A forest of books surrounded them, stretching from the floor to the ceiling, while files stacked on the carpet rose up like a thick undergrowth. But instead of the scented pink magnolias outside the window of Papa's study, the rain-stained glass revealed a dense cluster of dull brick and concrete buildings under a drab sky. It was only a short interview. Mama Apaya briefly told Mr. Nathan what Shadi had already told her, including the information about Uncle Deli. She'd already made inquiries at the art college herself, and there was no further news of him. Mr. Nathan wrote down the children's full names, with Shadi spelling out Folashade and Olufemi Adewale. Shadi was relieved that Femi let her speak for him. In his don't-care mood, he might easily give away their real names. Mr. Nathan also asked for their dates and place of birth. "So you are Nigerian," he said. "And is that where you've come from, Nigeria?" Shadi nodded. "Well, that is all we need at this stage to get you temporary admission. But later you'll have to explain more about why your family thought you were in danger, and why they sent you here without proper passports. The immigration officers will also want to know how you came into the country." Although Mr. Nathan spoke without any threat in his voice, his words triggered something in Femi, setting him off like a firecracker. "We came with the lady, but we don't know her name," he blurted. Shadi stared at her brother. "Did the lady tell you her name, but you've forgotten it?" asked Mr. Nathan. He scanned both children as Mrs. Bankoli's words rang in Shadi's ears. "If you tell anyone my name, my friend in Lagos will never help your father." Shadi hesitated. Keeping quiet was easier than lying. "She didn't tell us," Femi mumbled. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear that," said Mr. Nathan. "It didn't tell us," Femi repeated more loudly. He kept his eyes fixed on his new trainers, which were busy scuffing the carpet. "You know it will be very important that you tell us everything, but this will do for now." Mr. Nathan spoke patiently. Shadi felt her cheeks were burning. Surely even Mama would have understood why they dare not tell the whole truth.